So we've talked about human interest and we've talked about new campaigns as a way to generate coverage for your business, because those are the kind of stories that make the news. Another kind of story, which is totally doable for any business, is research. If you've brought out some new research, and it has to be your research to be your news, that could potentially be a story. So for example, if your business is in HR consultancy, it could be that you carry out research, and it doesn't have to be huge research, it doesn't have to be thousands, but it could be even just among 100, or qualitative research among business owners or HR managers to find out what are their main pain points. And if the research is interesting enough, or the outcome is interesting enough, you've potentially got yourself a story. Again, I don't want this to be theory, I want it to be grounded in actual practice. So I have an example for you. This is a story that I did where essentially it was my client who's in aviation, and the story is that airline HR departments are perhaps not as well qualified to assess pilots. So if you know the industry, which you may not, but essentially it's an industry where to be a pilot is no mean feat, of course. You need to do lots of training, there's lots of tick box training, but also there's a lot of in-depth flight hours and various different criteria rigorously tested that they need to meet to safely fly you on your holiday, as they should. The interesting thing that came out from the research was that essentially there was a skills shortage when it came to pilots, which is scary if you've got a holiday coming up, but also the other side of it was that the airline HR departments are incredibly overworked with hundreds of unsuitable applications to wade through, and essentially they're not in the best position to assess pilots or the next generation of pilots coming through. So this was a great story, and it got a lot of coverage and a lot of traction because it was pertinent. It was a business-based story, it was B2B, and it got into Airline Publications, it got into HR Publications, and it got into Recruitment Publications because it touched on 3 different core areas: the specialist area of aviation, the recruitment, and the HR function. So, you know, think about your business, really have a think about what area, and don't think about it just for the sake of PR. Think, what would be interesting for me to find out from my target audience about my industry? So for me, I mentioned in a previous video that I did research into startups to find out what their views, experience and understanding of PR was. And I was actually surprised by the results. So what could you find out, whatever industry you're in? You know, you may have a clothing label, and it might be that you want to know about what's an accessible price point for teenagers. It may be that you work in a translation service, and you might want to find out what languages are the most common that people come to you for your services for. There's so many different opportunities, and actually you are the expert in your field. So it's for you to really see what kind of research makes the news, or what kind of research is interesting to you, because if it's interesting, it's quite likely that it might be news and interesting to your target publications. The other thing to bear in mind, the caveat, is while I say it has to be your research, you can also potentially get PR coverage by commenting on big national research or big national stories if you get there in time. So to give you an example, a new paper came out, new research, and it was around parents that smoke in cars, and it was the secondary inhalation to children. So off the back of that research, I very quickly got on the phone to my local journalist, not the national, and said, would you be interested in hearing an expert comment from my client who's a clinician and talks about this kind of, can talk in depth about whether it's going to work, whether that smoking secondary inhalation is a big factor in the UK or in that area. And that's potentially a story if you get there in time. So research, whether it's through surveys, whether it's through focus groups, whether it's through in-depth one-to-ones, can potentially be another way for you to get PR coverage.